Hi guys, Ciarán here, English teacher at the Dublin Academy. Just here today with the English paper 2, fresh off the presses. I'm just going to do a quick kind of a look at it and a quick analysis here of what we've seen. So I suppose this is the biggie really in terms of English, what we spend so much time preparing for. A significant change, of course, this year, the fact that you only had to do 2 out of the 3 sections and all 3 sections were worth 70 marks. When we look at the single text, vast majority of us, I suppose, looking at the Othello question. So again, as in other years, we had our 2 questions. First question here, focusing on, I suppose we anticipated that we might see something involving minor characters. So a standard relationship question, this time focusing on the relationship between Iago and Emilia, and the fascinating and disturbing elements of that. An interesting one for students with a real kind of knowledge of the relationships of the play and how that sort of ties in maybe with some of the primary ones. Our second question then, probably a little more accessible, possibly more popular for students, sort of thematic one, looking at the idea of Othello as the outsider and how much that impacts the action and the tragic dimension of the play, which of course really is a question about sort of racism, being excluded, and how that ultimately impacts it and our understanding of the drama. So I think certainly 2 questions there which offered a nice choice to students. On our comparative study, again, we had our 3 modes this year, just like last year. So we had our literary genre first, again, looking at the elements of storytelling. The first question focusing on the aspect of plot and how plot is advanced and techniques to do that. So again, a nice sort of question for those who are technically minded when it comes to story. And the second question then focusing on techniques around characters and characterization. So again, a fundamental part of storytelling. So I'd imagine anybody attempting that section would have found that one particularly doable. Cultural context certainly will be a popular choice for many students this year. And the 2 various questions, the A and B question focusing then on power and how power is maintained in the different cultures. So again, certainly an element of the cultural context that students would have very much prepared for. And the second element then looking at the idea of individualism and expressions of individualism. So certainly anybody who studied Ladybird this year, which is a very popular text, will certainly have a lot to get their teeth into there. The expression of individualism. Nora from A Doll's House also comes to mind, and the culture in which she finds herself, in which her individualism is repressed. So lots there for students to really explore. The comparative elements there between that. And again, similar to a question we saw a number of years ago about characters rebelling against their society and whether or not they succeed in that rebellion. So an interesting one for those who are really looking at that, the context and the repressive elements. General vision and viewpoint, an interesting one for the A and B, centering around the idea of resilience, the resilience that's been displayed by individuals in the community and how that impacts on the vision. So certainly one that students might have been happy to take a stab at. I suppose the second question, the longer one for 70 marks, a little bit more standard, and the idea of characters who are disadvantaged and how they're treated and how that ultimately impacts the vision. So strong connection there between the characters' outcomes and the general treatment of the characters and how that impacts the general vision of life. So again, certainly something that we'd have discussed quite a lot in class. Poetry, I suppose, always the favorite in terms of like the predictions and so on. First of all, just looking at our unseen poem, nice, fairly straightforward and accessible unseen poem. And immediately we see some interesting choices in terms of the structure of the poem, the lack of formal punctuation, grammar, so plenty there for students to kind of write about, and almost sort of a Dickinson-esque sort of quality to it at different points. Lots of enjambment and poetic techniques on display for students to write about and engage with. And then finally, when we turn to our prescribed poets, so we have our 5 this year again, similar to last year. Traditionally it's 4, but looking at the 5, probably a couple of eyebrows raised here, I'm not going to lie. I certainly was mildly surprised by some of the poets. I think the probably obvious omission here that a lot of students would have been expecting to see was D.H. Lawrence. So no appearance on the paper this year, unfortunately, for those who were really enthusiastic about writing about him. I suppose the other very maybe predictable poet that we do see on the paper is Brendan Kennelly, not least probably due to his recent passing away. So nice to see that Kennelly appearing and giving students something to work with here. We have Adrienne Rich, I suppose, when it comes to the American female poets. We had Emily Dickinson, Adrienne Rich, and Elizabeth Bishop. Again, Elizabeth Bishop, I think, would have been a very popular choice among students. But it seems that the SEC have opted for Adrienne Rich instead. But again, for those who have prepared Rich, a fairly accessible question there about her use of imagery and the diverse range of imagery and so on. William Wordsworth, of our two romantic poets, Wordsworth and Keats, Wordsworth is the one that they've opted for. And an interesting question here which really challenges students around there. The appeal and whether or not it's even something that still has an appeal and its relevance in the 21st century. So certainly one there for the thoughtful student. Emily Dickinson, probably the most surprising poet in many respects to appear on the paper. Dickinson, I think in probability wise, was probably the least likely. We've seen her quite a number of times over the last number of years. But all the same, a very popular poet, a poet a lot of students would have studied in fifth year. And again, a very accessible question here about how her vivid and energetic style helps with the fascination of her poetry. And then number 5, our bonus poet, if you like, W.B. Yeats. Always a solid sort of bet, I suppose, in those regards. Yeats is a very popular poet, the quintessential Irish poet in many respects. And a nice question here about his aesthetic use of language, communicating insights into a history, myth and legend. So again, very much in the wheelhouse of Yeats and some that students will largely have been prepared for. So that's it. Certainly an interesting paper too. I hope it was something that you were happy with, that you were able to take a good stab at each of your two chosen sections. Again, the diversity of choice this year is again huge, I think, in terms of giving students lots of assurance. And I hope it went well for all of you, and well done.